Hey Merfolk fans, I'm Joe. Thanks very much for joining me today. If you'd like to support my channel, please check out the link above to my Patreon page. I'm here with round 3 of a Modern League, currently sitting at 2-0. Looks like I won the die roll for this round. And this is kind of a weak opening hand, but it's a keep for me. We've got card draw with Silvergill Adept, a second creature in Mutavault. Force of Negation can potentially help us combat any really broken stuff like Hogak Vine or Dredge. So it's not very inspiring, and there's a case to be made to mulligan this hand, but I chose to keep it. I actually made a couple of misplays in this first round, and it's one of the advantages of watching the replays is I get to learn from my mistakes, and you guys get to learn as well. Now, I did notice one mistake as I was actually playing this match, but another misplay I didn't notice really until I watched my replay, so... Alright, so Llanowar Reborn shows us that we're playing against Hardened Scales Affinity, which is one of our worst matchups, so I was a little bit disappointed to be paired against them, sitting at 2-0. The opponent did mulligan to 6, and it does look like they're having kind of a slow start. Definitely didn't want to draw a 5th land there, and having not drawn a second Merfolk, I can't play this Silvergill Adept yet. However, I did play my Mutavault on turn 1, so now I can activate that and attack to start getting in for some damage. A second Llanowar Reborn, continuing their very slow opening, and playing just a Welding Jar. No creatures yet, and no Hardened Scales. So I will take this AEther Vial up to 2. And I drew a second Silvergill. So the options here basically are to play a Silvergill, revealing another Silvergill, and then potentially Vial in the second Silvergill. I chose, however, to Vial the first one in, so it would give me more choices as to what to do with my mana. Since I've got the AEther Vial here, if I don't draw another creature, I can just Vial in Silvergill next turn and continue getting some value out of the AEther Vial, meanwhile attacking with the Mutavault or just holding up 3 mana to hardcast Force of Negation. Right, so Llanowar Reborn triggers, and the opponent chooses not to put any counters on my Silvergill. Lord is pretty solid, and since I have another Merfolk in hand now, I'll go ahead and play the Silvergill Adept. Now, this is actually, I would say, a minor misstep already. This wasn't one of the misplays I was talking about. There's 2 more misplays to come in this game alone. Now, against Hardened Scales Affinity, which I haven't really seen too much of lately, but it's a matchup where we really want to be on our toes as much as possible and have a strategy lined up at the beginning that we can follow to give us the best chance of actually, coming out victorious. One of the sort of fundamental strategies against this deck is to play your lords as quickly as possible, because once they get Walking Ballista onto the battlefield, we can either just lose the game, or if our lords are big enough, hopefully, maintain a board presence and draw Spreading Seas, play it, and win. As things stand, I've got these 2 little 2/1s on the board that are very weak to Walking Ballista. So the opponent played a Metallic Mimic, naming Construct. They've got 1 mana left here. They're going to go ahead and run out Walking Ballista for X = 0, but they get to move these 2 counters from the Llanowar Reborns, and it also gets a counter from Metallic Mimic. So it's going to enter as a 3/3. And I guess in this situation, if I had played out the Lord, the opponent could have pinged the Lord twice, and then either just bottom out the Walking Ballista, kill the Silvergill Adept, but more likely they would have just killed the Lord, leaving the Silvergill Adept. But as things stand, the opponent can kill both of my creatures and still have 1 counter left. So again, in hindsight, I probably should have played out the Lord, almost certainly should have played out the Lord first to buff the toughness, to play around this card, which is probably the single most difficult card for us to play around in the matchup. So AEther Vial is going to stay on 2, and our back's kind of against the wall now. Well, a second Lord does help things. I'm going to start off just by playing the 1 Lord, activate Mutavault, and just swing in. Imagine the opponent doesn't really have blocks in this spot. Now, I could bring in the second Lord right now, but I chose to see a little bit more of what the opponent was going to do. All right, a second Welding Jar, and then Throne of Geth. So if they tap this thing and sacrifice any artifact, basically these useless Welding Jars over here, they get to proliferate, which is pretty scary in the face of Walking Ballista. It's extra scary if they get a Hardened Scales down, because instead of putting one extra counter, it's going to put two extra counters. And this is the first misplay that I noticed during the game. Was I sort of blanked out and didn't recognize the fact that I could have countered this, which is sort of unacceptable. But I guess I'm still getting used to being able to play counter spells for free, and I blanked for a second. I decided instead that before he has a chance to proliferate, I'm going to go ahead and just get the second Lord onto the table. So get this guy down. Throne of Geth resolved. In hindsight, I definitely would have pitched the Trickster to counter Throne of Geth. The opponent followed up with a free Hangerback Walker. It enters with one counter from Metallic Mimic because it is a construct. And now it's going to make the proliferate from Throne of Geth that much more explosive. So I'm going to leave Aether Vial on 2 here. I drew another Force of Negation, so deck is kind of mocking me in this spot. Easiest way to start this turn is just to cycle the Waterlogged Grove. And a third Force of Negation, so kind of karma there for not using the first Force. So I'm going to activate Mutavault here and get in for a big attack, see if I can get the opponent to make some misstep that I can potentially take advantage of. So they think a little bit about blocks, and ultimately put the Metallic Mimic in front of one of the Lords. It's going to deal 2 damage, and then they could proliferate, put another counter on Walking Ballista, and then finish off this Lord. So I think damage damage occurs, and then the opponent proliferated, sacking one of the Welding Jars. So this was the second misplay. This is the one that I noticed while watching the replay. Is I got kind of psyched out with the Trickster. I didn't really understand how I should have timed it, or if I could actually do anything. I guess I thought, the opponent can already ping the Lord, so what would be the benefit of flashing in Trickster here with Vial? But there's a big benefit, obviously, right? I mean, you guys probably see it. If I flash in Trickster now with Proliferate on the stack, the opponent has a choice to make. They can either just sacrifice the Walking Ballista to finish off this Lord, or they can let Trickster's ability resolve, in which case Ballista won't be able to kill the Lord this turn. It'll still get a second counter, but the Lord will still be alive on the opponent's turn. And even if they proliferate again, going up to three counters, I'll still have my board, and at most the Walking Ballista could just kill one of my Lords next turn. But as I mentioned, it was a misplay, and I didn't respond with Trickster. So, in hindsight, I definitely deserved to lose this round because I gave the opponent pretty much every opportunity to beat me. So Lord down, and this Trickster, now that Walking Ballista, they get to untap with more proliferate. I'm just not going to be able to climb out of this, and Arcbound Ravager just makes it so much more difficult, because at any moment now, they can sack the Hangerback Walker and dump a million counters on Walking Ballista, effectively ending the game. So there's really no time to flash in Trickster at this point, because they can respond in any number of ways, and I was getting pretty close to scooping. So Benthic Biomancer, I can adapt, pitch one of these stupid forces in my hand. Drew another Waterlogged Grove, we can cycle that. So at least demonstrating that our deck does have a nice ability to dig for cards that we need. But at this moment, with the Ravager especially, this Hangerback Walker gets to keep getting more counters, and I've dug myself too big of a hole for me to climb back out. Opponent is just going to play another Walking Ballista, ping with one and ping with the other, and I just scooped. So I definitely had a chance there. I could have countered the Throne of Geth, Even if I didn't, I could have responded to the first Proliferate activation by flashing in Trickster to put the opponent on a tricky decision with Walking Ballista. I don't know if I would have won the game, but I definitely could have played it much better. So hopefully you guys learned something from this game 1. Let's go ahead to game 2, look at the sideboard strategy, and see if I played anything a little bit better in game 2. Okay, back for game 2. I'm going to be on the play this time. I took out a couple of Master of Waves, all 4 Benthic Biomancers, the idea being that we need to use all of our mana all the time, especially since I brought in Deprives. Being on the play, we want to be on the front foot, and Force of Negation, it's more of a reactive spell. You only get to cast it on the opponent's turn, and Deprive gets to hit things like Walking Ballistas. So since we're going to be getting to 2 mana before the opponent, it just seemed like Deprive is a better choice being on the play. So again, I took out 4 Bends, 4 Force of Negation, 4 Relic of Progenitus, 2 Master of Waves. I brought in 4 Deprives. So let me count that first. That's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So basically 14 cards. And I brought in everything from my sideboard except the Grafdigger's Cage. So that's going to be 4 Deprives, 3 Echoing Truths, 3 Dismembers. Am I missing anything? 4, 3, and 3 is 10. And then the other card would be, I guess, the Phyrexian Revokers, right? That's the 4 that brings me up to 14. So 4 Deprives, 4 Phyrexian Revokers, pretty great in this matchup because they can name Walking Ballista. Can also name Arcbound Ravager. There's a bunch of good stuff that they can name. Throne of Geth, etc. So 4 Deprive, 4 Phyrexian Revokers, 3 Echoing Truths, and 3 Dismembers. Let's see what the opening hand looked like. A mulligan, and kind of a reluctant keep. That's definitely going to the bottom. And we're going to start Island, and no turn 1 play. Opponent has Animation Module, which I'm happier to see than Hardened Scales. This is an engine, but it's definitely not as explosive as Hardened Scales. Okay, so Trickster's pretty good. As I mentioned in game 1, I guess I'm going to want to be a little bit more on my toes about when to flash in Trickster. I chose to leave up Deprive here. If the opponent doesn't cast anything that I want to counter, then I can flash in Trickster, or if they play some creature that I can dismember, I'll just do that. So leaving up my options here. Arcbound Worker, not very scary, but it does get a trigger from Animation Module. They get to start making tokens if they want to. So towards the end of learning a little bit more about this matchup, let's take a closer look at Animation Module. So the thing that this does most often is the top ability. Whenever 1 or more +1 counters are put on a permanent you control, so whenever one of these guys with Modular enters the battlefield, or whenever Hardened Scales puts a counter on something, they get to pay 1 extra mana, and if they do, they make a 1/1 colorless servo. But it has a second ability. They can pay 3 mana and tap this to choose a counter on any permanent or player, and give that permanent or player another counter of that kind. So kind of a targeted proliferate ability. So not too much going on that turn. So I'm going to go ahead and flash in the Trickster here, tap down the Arcbound Worker, and drew a Lord for the turn. But it's tricky because they have so many crazy things that they could play, from Walking Ballista to Hardened Scales, that even though stacking Lords is a great way to resist Walking Ballista, I felt that the better play here was just to hold up Deprive. So the opponent went for Ballista X = 1, and I'm going to take this opportunity to use the Deprive, since I did leave up the mana for it, and then a second Animation Module. So we're managing to keep the opponent sort of at a simmer. They're not sort of exploding yet. Phyrexian Revoker is a nice draw, but I don't think it's quite time to play that yet. We don't really have any amazing targets, or rather any cards to name. There's no Ballista on the table. And Revoker even works if we hardcast it, not even vialed in, with a Ballista on the table, because the best that they can do is just either kill our creatures with whatever they have on the Ballista, or just hit our face, because once Revoker resolves, the Ballista just can't activate anymore. But it's, as I mentioned, it's not time to play the Revoker yet. I'm going to play a Lord, which hopefully is going to give me some resistance to the Walking Ballistas. Get in with Merfolk Trickster. I think the opponent took it, went down to 15. Plays an Inkmoth Nexus, which is a little bit scary because they've got a lot of artifacts that they could potentially sack and put on top of that thing. All right, and it's a second Walking Ballista. So X equals 1, they get a trigger from Animation Module. And actually, they get 2 triggers from the Animation Module. And from each Animation Module. And they chose not to activate, or rather pay for the second one, instead leaving up 1 mana for Mox Opal. Not quite sure why they did it that way. So I untapped, rather than just dismember the Walking Ballista immediately. Potentially a slight misstep. I'm not sure why I wouldn't have dismembered it right away, but after drawing the island, I've got nothing really much better to do, so I'm just going to dismember that thing. Instead of going to my face with the 1 damage, it goes to the Trickster, which is interesting because it just makes it that much harder to attack into these servos. And it's a very defensive play. Potentially we'll see why this opponent left up mana here, but not seeing it yet. So at this point, with all of these artifacts on the battlefield, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If they played Arcbound Ravager, they'd be really close to lethal immediately with Inkmoth Nexus. Actually, they'd probably be there, right? Because if they play a Ravager, they get a trigger from an Animation Module, and I think they'd have at that point enough to just dump lethal onto Inkmoth Nexus. So at this point, I played Revoker, naming preemptively Arcbound Ravager, because, as I mentioned, it would just wreck us if it hit the battlefield and wasn't turned off by the Phyrexian Revoker. Okay, so here's a Hangerback Walker. Not very scary. Opponent's just going to keep going wide with servos. Things have sort of stabilized now, and getting a second Lord onto the table is excellent. Just that much more resistance. I'm going to get in with this Merfolk Trickster. If they want to trade off like 4 of their creatures for Trickster, that's pretty good, but instead they just block with Arcbound Worker. I'm going to flash in Trickster here to turn off the Worker so that he won't be able to redistribute his counter when he dies. Just getting some value out of the Trickster while I have an opportunity to do that. Okay, here's another Hangerback Walker. They get another servo, continuing to go wide. Obviously, we have a way to punch through this if we draw Spreading Seas eventually. Another Lord is pretty great. I started to feel pretty good about where I was. No reason to crack the Waterlogged Grove yet, since we'd have no more mana. If the opponent did sideboard Thoughtseize, they'd be able to take whatever I drew. I'm going to get in with these 2 5/5s. It's a lot of power to just leave sitting back, and the opponent just chumps, which makes sense since they can make as many of these little tokens as they want. Hangerback Walker will grow. Opponent draws, plays a land, passes back to me. Mutavault is another creature, and now is a good opportunity to go ahead and cycle the Waterlogged Grove. And there's Spreading Seas, so I'm going to slam that right onto Inkmoth Nexus. Opponent had nothing to do. I mean, even if they had a Dismember, I'd still be attacking everybody with Island Walk. It would be 3, 3, 4, and 4. So 14, put them down to 1, and they don't have anything approaching a lethal attack at this point, especially with this Arcbound Ravager. Phyrexian Revoker naming Arcbound Ravager. So fortunate to get there in Game 2. Went much better for us than Game 1. Let's go ahead and see how Game 3 went. All right, back for Game 3. Opponent's going to be on the play here. It'd be nice if we got a good opening hand. And this is reasonable. Opponent mulligan to 6. And then mulligan to 5, so maybe we have a chance against Hardened Scales here. Darksteel Citadel into Arcbound Worker. Another Force of Negation. Not the best, but it might just get pitched to this Force of Negation. Okay, Llanowar Reborn, continuing their slow start. I play an island, and I I think the best approach with just this Arcbound Worker on the battlefield is to just get the Lords out onto the table as quickly as possible. They don't have Hardened Scales. They don't have Throne of Geth. Well, there's Hardened Scales. So I'm going to counter that by pitching the first Force of Negation to the second Force of Negation, since that's one of the cards in their deck that can just enable all sorts of crazy stuff. Suddenly, every Walking Ballista is entering with an extra counter, and it can be like impossible to fight back from. So at this point, we've only got 2 double blue spells, and so we can play 1 this turn and 1 next turn, so it's time to start getting the Mutavaults out onto the board. As I mentioned, the plan is definitely just to get Lords out. Currently not super afraid of what the opponent is doing. We'll crack in for 3 here, and hope that their mulligan to 5 doesn't have anything too crazy going on. Okay, so here's another Hardened Scales. Nothing to do about that now. Okay, and opponent just passes. So I guess they didn't have another land drop to make, and they didn't have, I guess, anything else to play for the turn. So another Lord is excellent, because as I mentioned, the plan is just get Lords down onto the table. Okay, opponent's not going to put a counter on my Lord. Going to activate the Mutavault and get in for a nice attack here. It's 13 damage. Opponent thinks about blocking and then ultimately does block. Okay, so they're going to take 8, going from 17 down to 9. They play a second Llanowar Reborn. They must have just drawn that since they didn't play it last turn. And they play a Walking Ballista X equals 1. And this is actually pretty insane because they're going to get a Hardened Scales trigger. It's not really a trigger, it's more of like a replacement effect, right? If 1 or more +1 counters would be put on a creature, you put 1 more of that. So he's going to enter with 1, which gets an extra 1 from Hardened Scales. Then he gets 1 from this land, and then another 1, and then this land, and then another 1. So instead of entering as a 1/1, this guy's going to enter as a 6/6. And you can see the benefit of playing out all my Lords. If instead of playing this Lord last turn, I had held up double blue for the Trickster, it still wouldn't have been super terrible because my Lords would have been 3/3s. And then I could have flashed in the Trickster if he just unloaded at that point onto the 2 Lords. It would have been sort of okay. The Ballista would have been off the table. The threat would have been neutralized because he's not going to have all of those graft triggers a second time. It was only kind of a one-shot thing. So if I flash in the Trickster, Lords were 3/3s, the Ballista could kill them. At that point, I'd have a Trickster, and I'd still have the Lord in hand. Could play the Lord, activate a Mutavault, swing in with the Trickster, opponent would go down to 3, and we'd still be sort of sitting okay. But as things stand, if he kills a Lord as a 4/4, the rest of my guys are 3/3s, and Walking Ballista with only 2 counters left wouldn't be able to do anything about that. So I think just playing the Lords out as quickly as possible in general is a pretty strong strategy against Hardened Scales Affinity. So here I can just play the Trickster, and I think the opponent realizes they have no counterplay. And yeah, we managed to get the win against Hardened Scales despite multiple misplays in Game 1. I definitely learned something from this match, especially from watching the replays and making this video for you guys. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Please leave your comments down below. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And if you'd like to support the channel and encourage me to make more of these videos, please check out my Patreon page and consider pledging $1 or $2. I'll see you guys in the next video where I'll be back with round 4 of this Modern League. And yeah, I'll see you there. Bye.